Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. Well, Kevin, we got a question from one of our listeners, and this person suggested that we do an episode on conflict, which I thought was a really interesting idea because I think one of our takes on things is the importance of bonds, and connecting work with bonds. I think is one of our what makes us unique among self improvement work approaches. And then conflict obviously being one of the main obstacles to bonds, to the deepening of bonds. So, what are your thoughts then, Kevin, on when conflicts challenge bonds?
Hmm. I just think this is very typical, Sharif, of you, how you are always siding with the people who ask us questions and as
Yeah.
if they get everything right all the time.
I don't see why you're so opposed to the idea of taking questions from people.
Exactly. So no, just to typify the how people can get into conflicts and what it feels like to get entrenched
Yeah.
in a conflict.
Yeah. I almost
Because
kind of enjoyed that and wanted to keep arguing, even though I knew it was made up, you know?
yeah, I feel like there's
They just
something
kind of draw you in.
magnetic
Yeah.
about a conflict. Yeah, I think that you would actually define the conflict as hyperfocus and a bond. And I think that's a great way of putting it. It's when a bond is in a state of hyperfocus and you get this incredible magnification of things that don't matter at all. And the minimization of everything else. All these classic cognitive distortions are shown powerfully when people who have a bond get in a state of conflict. So I think there's a lot that the optimal work theory, does have to say about conflict. Uh, and maybe the first thing that we would say is that conflict is actually a good thing, not a
I knew
bad
you were
thing.
gonna say that
Did you?
because yeah, well, first of all, when you said cognitive distortion, that gets me thinking automatically about reframing because I know that reframing, in its original development was about addressing cognitive distortion. It also occurred to me that my guess is that I'm not widely read in the conflict literature, but my guess is a good amount of it at least focuses on conflict resolution, and that's already treating conflict as a bad thing. So it's thinking about solving problems and achieving certain outcomes. So I was thinking your take isn't going to be exactly about conflict resolution. It's going to be about how to see conflict as an opportunity for growth, which I think will be it's hard for me to to stomach,
Yeah. So because conflicts touch on bonds, and we have an instinctive protective mechanism at work within us to defend bonds. The most intense conflicts in our life will be those we're closest to. So if they're doing something that somehow makes the stability or sustainability of the bond being called into question, then it can be extremely painful. So, or if you think that somehow the bond is failing. So, I think that if I'm reading Sue Johnson right, and her work on, um, when she developed this emotionally focused therapy to help uh, couples, deal with conflict, and she has a very popular book called "Hold Me Tight," about these ways that you can, in conversations, go down a dark hole. And so she calls them yeah, I forgot some kind of demonic spiral or something. I don't remember what, but they're really recognizable to people. That there's just classic ways that if couples have been married long enough that they get in fights that sometimes will just spiral. And once it's going down a certain pathway, then old things get brought in very predictably, and that's actually the mark of a bad conflict or of a conflict that now is destructive. Is that they're very predictable. that you can tell once this fight gets going, it's just going to be the same emotions, the same thing gets said. There's going to be a lot of rigidity, a lot of certainty on both sides, and people just kind of hunkering down for their positions. But the thing that she says is that's these conversations are always about bonds. And that's really what people want is the strengthening of the bond, which I think is precisely the good that can come out of any conflict. Yeah, that any conflict can be the setting of a bond being built more strongly. So it's necessary in bonds that there are moments of ruptures and repairs. I think that is just the human nature that there always will be moments of rupture, but then as you can see the will of the other person working at repairing it, you get more and more certain of what's on the other side of the bond. Really in the heart of the other person is a stable commitment to you. So even if it feels like the bond is missing or broken, they're still there to repair the bond. And so having rupture and repair is actually really essential. And so every conflict that happens between two people is always a little bit of rupture that will lead to hopefully the best kinds of repair.
So yeah, maybe you could clarify exactly how that happens, because I guess in one on the one hand, it seems like the conflict can be a sign that there is a deep bond there. So, but that's not exactly what you're pointing out. So the reframe is not, okay, we're in a conflict, and because we're in a conflict, that shows that actually there is a bond, and we are close. For example, you don't get into maybe big emotional conflicts with someone who you just don't care at all about. It tends to be people who you're very close with that you get into these kinds of conflicts with. Um, but that's not exactly what you're saying. You're saying that actually good can come from the conflict, right?
Yeah, that yes. So the amount of emotional triggering you get and the amount of ruminations you get is a sign that it's dealing with a bond that's really important. So if your conflict with someone, is if it's with someone that you had loved in the past at least, and now it's something is deeply bothering you about that. Okay, well, this is a moment then where what really has to be done is the bond itself in your mind and heart has to be prioritized again. And you have to sincerely ask the question, how do I put the bond first? So, whatever the issue might be, that could be a lack of sincerity on your part, that in the context of this relationship, you are seeking more of an outcome of some kind. Maybe that they apologize, maybe that they do something. Whatever it is, it could be still an outcome that you're seeking, as if that were more important than the bond itself. And there needs to be a sense of letting go of outcomes, for the sake of building the bond. It may be then that yes, later on, those things can be addressed, once the bond is built stronger, and then you can let the person know the need you once felt for an apology on something. But I don't think forcing other people to do any kind of behavior, any kind of outcome from the other person's behavior, I think that if that's what the issue is about, then there's on our own end, we have to let go of that need totally. The purpose of the bond is actually to have two people united, not to have people controlling each other. The bond cannot be a means of control, of trying to get others to do your will and that they have to agree with you. So it can't be that the bond is just a form of coercion. But I think is what a lot of skeptics think, that bonds just are coercive always. So the opposite view is that the bond is what allows both people to bring out their best, their most kind, most understanding, most generous self. So that there is something about the bond that actually makes us more fully human, more fully at our very best. But if a conflict is stopping that from happening, then I think there's a lot of growth then that will come from diving deep into this conflict and seeing then how do I let this conflict now bring out the best in me instead of the predictable worst.
Okay, this now, I guess we're assuming that it takes two to fight, two to argue, two to be in a conflict. Uh, Now, my guess is that when people are in a conflict, they tend to think that the other person is wrong or has done something to harm the bond. So if one person is in a position where they think or feel that the other person is harming the bond, and they may actually be right that the other person actually is engaging in some behavior that's harming the bond. I don't know, they're ignoring the other person, or they slight the other person frequently. So then how do you deal with that without, you know, generating a conflict that can escalate? Are you supposed to just accept all offenses?
Yeah, so say that one spouse has the normal reaction to any conflict of avoiding talking to the other spouse. So it's just the complete cold shoulder. And then that just drives the other spouse crazy because they feel like the other one totally shuts them out, and now there's nothing that they can do. Okay, so if you were to put a pause button then right at that moment and just look at this from a right brain, left brain point of view. Okay, so take the person who's on the receiving end of the cold shoulder and is getting furious about it, and to see in that person, let's say it's a he, you know, is does he have any rigidity on his end? Is he seeing, oh, this is predictable, this is just what she always does, saying the other's a she, and then he has all the same emotions, every time, and he's feeling frustrated. Well, what would it look like for him to own what just happened and to say, you know what? If I am so frustrated right now by this, it must be because I'm using the same strategies that always fail. Okay, so if he tried to like be curious about what strategies he was using and to just be a little willing to be humble and to admit that maybe my strategies going so far haven't been working. Maybe they're backfiring. Maybe they're being misunderstood by my partner. Okay, so there might be a lot of things that might be, maybe my timing actually lacks understanding. That I'm trying to bring up something when they're just not capable of dealing with it. So, or I broadsided them, or who knows what it might be the reasons, why the other person somehow felt like they had to withdraw. But the more ownership the person is willing to take and say, you know what, I'm going to try to do this better, you know, and to not let themselves get into the fight mode, to try to escalate it, to force attention, which is usually what happens. In my mind, then, the ideal that puts an end to this particular conflict is meekness. Meekness being one of the least desired emotional rare virtues, I would say. Who wants, it's like you wouldn't put it on your resume. I can be extraordinarily meek. And yet it is the height of self mastery. Because it means you're willing to suffer wrong. You're willing to turn the other cheek so that that cheek could also be struck. That's a quite an example, the stretch of what meekness means. But you are committed to truly doing new behaviors to build up the bond with the person you love. So that means you're very flexible, you're curious, you're asking questions of yourself and others, and you're willing to feel the emotions that come and how frustrating it is. But that meekness actually makes it impossible for a state of high conflict to continue existing, but between two people. So it's actually, while you can't control the outcome of you can't control the other person, you can with one person. If one person makes the commitment to this kind of heroic level of meekness for the sake of the bond, I think that they can ensure that high conflict ceases.
Yeah. Interesting. So, okay, meekness is not weakness. It's actually a kind of strength. It's patience and fortitude. So it's people shouldn't confuse that with just giving up, right? You're actually staying totally focused on the ultimate end, which is the deepening of the bond. Now, what if this happens in the context of, say, a work situation where I disagree with a coworker on the direction that we should proceed in, and so this has the potential to escalate into a conflict. And then I'm listening to the podcast and I say, okay, I should be meek in this situation. So does that mean that I should just focus on the bond with the coworker and just, okay, let him have his way, and we'll go in his direction, and I'll give up my point of view and just do what he wants to do? It seems like that's not exactly the right thing to do. Is just, you always give in to the other person's demands for the sake of the bond. So in the case of couples, I can more clearly see that, yeah, the bond is the ultimate objective. But in a work situation, it does seem like you can't just give up your opinion every single time. So how would you apply this advice in that
I
context?
don't think meekness has anything necessarily to say about what is decided or an outcome.
Okay.
So I think that in a work situation, meekness means that you are going to be committed to the path of investigating this issue together in a constructive way, not letting there just be an impasse and then letting sides form, and then trying to like divide the office into one side or the other. So you try to bring back complexity. You try to multiply viewpoints. So I think you try to stay engaged with the process in a very, very fluid and flexible way. In a sense, meekness is most opposed to a kind of righteousness, a kind of righteous rigidity, which is just like one of the hallmarks of bad conflict. I get a lot of this from Amanda Ripley's latest book on high conflict. So it's an interesting read as you go through, but she doesn't talk about left brain, right brain, at all in the context of the book. But when she lists what are like the qualities of good, healthy conflict, it's all these things we're talking about. They're fully right brained. She doesn't say this, but like, the bond is prioritized, which is right brain, and so you can be more humble and self forgetting, which she does mention. And that this idea that there are many emotions, not just the same repeated ones, but there's something creative and new and flexible that's possible as things are investigated. So rather than just quickly people taking sides the way they always do. So you want to see how to like turn this into a new and better conflict. If it feels like the same old conflict, then how do you make this conflict new and better? Well, make it less binary. Make it try to see if there are other options that aren't being considered. Uh, I also think, like, what if it's an example of a parent who has a teenage child who is in middle school or early high school and is demanding getting a smartphone? And then what do you do as the parent? Now, that, the child may be viewing things as there's only one outcome I am interested in. And so they shut down their entire right brain and they're locked into is there's no other issues. It's just unfair to not give this to me, and so they're totally certain and righteous. Well, then what would you do as a parent if you're locked in that?
I guess just get
Uh,
him the phone, right?
yeah,
The
that would
newest
be
version, preferably the most expensive one with
yeah,
everything.
yeah, so that they most impress their friends,
Yeah, yeah.
and then see if you can keep that up. See if you can pay the price of being the one to the most impress. I think we'd all see that would that the there are families will have different ways of approaching this question, and I don't think we in OptimalWork have the right answer. But just to say that for the parents to practice meekness here means that you take a long term view of the bond and you are interested in the long term good of your son or daughter and that your relationship in the long run is good. I think that has much more to do not with the actual outcome, but in the process. If the process is reasonable and open and flexible, and questions are looked at from different angles, and examples of other families are looked at, if there's like a fair process going through and then sharing what are the concerns and what's the evidence these concerns are true, I think it could be a way of educating them about the topic. So just because they're locked in doesn't mean you can't help them to be a little more curious about your point of view, a little more flexible to see that there might be other right ways of doing it. So I would want this to be like a way of learning to work together. Now, clearly, at some point, these kids are going to get the smartphone, because they're going to at least be off in college or having a job that can pay for it, and it's so there is this other element here of how do you actually strengthen the bond with the child through this whole process of contention, but not just to see contention as an affront to your dignity as a parent that has to be quashed, as if all questioning is an insult. But no, you want to be a joint effort at educating yourselves and each other about this question.
So maybe you could help us. I don't know if you have specific kind of exercises you would give people to help them kind of engage in this curiosity, flexibility. Ultimately, I think part of it is aimed at understanding the other person's point of view. At least a large part of it seems to me is, and then devising new solutions for it. So, do you have any guidelines or advice on how people can approach that question more specifically? I mean, one thing that comes to mind, which might be a little bit insane, is to like switch places with the other person and just, okay, you argue their point of view and they argue your point of view. Or maybe it's not necessarily about arguing, but so I don't know, do you have any concrete approaches that people can take in these types of situations?
I think the first step is that the conflict needs to be an opportunity to come to a deeper understanding of the both people involved. So that there's oftentimes, I know in companies that if there's not a lot of communication, going on among decision makers, then it can very quickly happen that there's some kind of conflict. But in my experience, that's always because of just there needs to be things that hadn't been communicated. And if you're in a very healthy company, which I've fortunately been able to be in a healthy company, then it's always used as an opportunity to grow in understanding with each other. So that is going to mean listening to the other and validating what you're hearing as much as possible. Even if the conflict is very intractable, or you might not think you can agree in the end, wonders can be worked by making sure you have understood the other person's position thoroughly. So Amanda Ripley talks a lot about this technique called looping, which is used in the mediation practices that lawyers often have. And looping is where you ask the person a question, like, what do you think would be what would be the best impact in your life from having the smartphone? And if it's parent and child, and then whatever the child says, the parent should then make the effort to say it back in as eloquent a way as possible, so that the child ideally would say, exactly. That's exactly my concern. Okay. Just getting to that point, already you are now in a state of healthy conflict. Okay. Because you can never be in that point and I think be in a state of bad or what they call high conflict. So we talk about this in our coaching class, which is soon to come out, that the importance of being able to summarize what you just understood. But even I like this idea, you say it more eloquently than the person themselves could say it. So you make the case better than they can. And then you go through. This is how Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica. He had the best arguments that could be against any position he took. And he stated them as eloquently and as simply as possible. So better than his opponents could have done it. But then he still is able to show. Now, in a huge number of cases that in the book High Conflict, Amanda Ripley goes through these cases, it just having that deep understanding may be enough. Right? Another thing I like that she says in the book is the importance of you have to like create time and space. So buy time, make space, so that every interaction isn't about this one topic. And there's a famous couples therapist. They're both actually John and Judy Gottlieb, who are couples therapists, and they're a couple. But they talk about the magic ratio of positive to challenging interactions for a marriage to be sustainable, and they said is at least 5 to 1. So you need 5 good interactions for every challenging interaction or frictional interaction. Yeah, if it's 2 to 1, it's just too tough. It's just not sustainable. So I think we aim, I think, I don't think you should aim for 5 to 1. I think you should aim for 20 to 1. So, you aim for something that is much higher. And so anything you do to just multiply good small interactions will diffuse the conflict. So I think that's another like, important lesson.
Well, Kevin, this is great stuff so far. Very helpful. I guess we're coming up on the end of our time here, but I'll give you a chance if you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with.
Uh, I think that when people are stuck in a conflict, there's usually one dreamed of resolution that they would find so fulfilling, for the other person just to say, I was wrong, or I was, or whatever it is. Um, Having your heart set on some outcome isn't worthy of a person who is in a bond with another person. Those outcomes are not as worthy as the person you're in the bond with. And many times, I think we have to sacrifice those particular outcomes. Sometimes people wish that something could have never happened. Like, okay, well, that's by its nature an unattainable outcome. So you're going to need to let go of that. So all outcomes when it comes to these things, and if it's about getting something you want, getting them to say or do something or give you something, I think that in a way that is all about seeking self. It's about seeking self-satisfaction or self-fulfillment. Ultimately, the bond doesn't fulfill you in the same way as self-fulfillment fulfills you. So yeah, if you're seeking selfishly to always be fulfilled, then it could seem to you like, well, this is the bond should just do that. No, bonds offer you a much deeper kind of fulfillment that I wouldn't even call fulfillment because it involves much more continual opportunities for growth through self giving. But the bond is worth it. The person you're in the bond with is worth it. And your life becomes meaningful to the extent that it's no longer about yourself getting fulfilled. It's more about building and fulfilling the bond and the other person.
That's very beautiful, Kevin. I'll try to put that into practice.
I will too.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharif.
All right, we'll be back next week.